every civilization that has ever existed, every empire, every kingdom, every tribe that ever sat around a fire and looked up at the sky has asked the same question. Who made this? Who is in charge of all of it? The storms, the seasons, the disasters, the impossible beauty of a world that no one asked to be born into but somehow has to navigate anyway. Is there anyone watching? Is there anyone responsible? The Greeks had an answer, and their answer was not a single being of perfect goodness sitting on a cloud dispensing justice with a gentle smile. Their answer was complicated. Their answer was a family of gods who were, in almost every way that mattered, exactly as difficult as the humans who worshipped them. Welcome, my friends. This channel exists for one reason. Every god who has ever been worshipped, feared, loved, or bargained with, had a life. A beginning and a story. Moments of power and moments of failure. Relationships that defined them. Decisions they could not take back. And they all had an end, or something that functioned like one. We are going to tell those stories. All of them. From the very first breath to the very last. No summaries. No shortcuts. The full life told the way it deserves to be told. Like the epic it is. We start where mythology always starts, with the Greeks. And we start with the one who sat at the top of everything. King of the gods, father of Olympus. The thunder that answered chaos with order, and the storm that occasionally created more chaos than he saw. This is his story. From the cave where he was born in secret, to the throne he bled to keep, to the world he built and watched and shaped and sometimes broke. Every god has a story. And this is the story of Zeus. Before Zeus, there was nothing that made sense. Not nothing as in empty space, or nothing as in a blank canvas. Nothing as in chaos. A formless, breathless void that existed before the concept of existence had even been invented. There was no light, no time, no shape. Just darkness, folded endlessly into itself. From that void, the first forces of the world clawed their way into being. Gaia, the earth herself, arose first, vast and ancient beyond any measuring. Then Tartarus, a pit of absolute darkness sinking beneath even the roots of the world, a place so deep and so final that later generations would use it as the worst punishment imaginable. And then from these two enormous primordial forces, the sky was born. His name was Uranus. He arched himself over Gaia, stretched from horizon to horizon, and looked down at the earth beneath him, and he made her his wife. Together, they had children, 12 of them, massive, elemental, and shining. Born from the union of earth and sky, they were called the Titans. They walked the world like forces of nature given flesh, and for a time, the cosmos was young and abundant, and it was theirs. But Uranus had a problem. He also had other children, and these ones were different. From the same union with Gaia came the Cyclopes, 3 one-eyed giants with the strength of earthquakes in their hands. And then the Hecatoncheia, 3 beings with 50 heads and 100 arms each. So enormous and so strange that the world seemed to shrink around them. Uranus took one look at them and felt something a father should never feel toward his own children. Disgust. He shoved them, his own flesh and blood, back into the earth. back into Gaia's body. He stuffed them into the darkness beneath the world and sealed it behind him, and went back to his throne as though he had done nothing worth thinking about. But Gaia felt every moment of it. Her children, imprisoned inside her own body, conscious and suffering. She carried that pain the way the earth carries pressure before an earthquake. Quietly at first, then not quietly at all. And slowly, over time, that pain turned into something colder and more purposeful than grief. It turned into a plan. She went to her Titan children and held up a weapon she had forged herself, a sickle of adamant, jagged and terrible. She looked at each of them and said, "One of you must end this. One of you must be brave enough to do what needs to be done to your father." 11 of them looked away. They heard the words. They saw the sickle, and they stepped back. But the youngest, the most cunning, the one who had always watched the others with calculating eyes, stepped forward and took it from her hand. His name was Cronus. What he did that night in the darkness, with his mother's blade, became the first act of violence in the history of the world. Uranus fell, and as he bled his divine ichor into the sea and the sky, he looked up at the sun who had just destroyed him, and he cursed him. He said, "Just as you have done to me, so shall one of your own children do to you." Cronus heard the curse. He looked down at the blade in his hand, and then he laughed, because he was king now, and kings, he believed, were above such things. He was wrong, and his being wrong is the reason this story exists. Cronus took his sister Rhea as his wife, and the two of them ruled over what later ages would call the Golden Age, a time so peaceful and abundant that humans who heard about it would ache with longing for something they had never experienced. The Titans governed the cosmos. The world was young. Nothing had gone wrong yet. But Cronus couldn't enjoy any of it. His father's curse had burrowed into him and taken root. Every time he looked at the wide open sky, every time the world was quiet enough for him to think, the words came back. "One of your children will do to you what you did to me." And the more he turned it over in his mind, the more he thought about what he had done, how sudden it was, how unstoppable, the more afraid he became. He had done it without warning. A child of his could do the same. So when Rhea became pregnant with their first child, Cronus made a decision that seemed, in his terrified mind, like the only logical solution. He would make sure none of his children ever had the opportunity to grow up. He would swallow them. Rhea gave birth to their first daughter, Hestia, the goddess of the hearth, barely drawing her first breath. And before she could even cry, Cronus took her from Rhea's arms and swallowed her whole. He felt the child descend into him, and he felt the fear recede slightly, and he went back to his throne. Then came Demeter, goddess of the harvest, swallowed. Then Hera, radiant, furious, already blazing with divine power even in infancy, swallowed. Then Hades, who was solemn and quiet even in the womb, swallowed. Then Poseidon, who would one day split the ocean floor with a gesture, swallowed. 5 children, 5 immortal gods, alive and conscious, imprisoned inside their father's body. Not dead. Gods couldn't die that easily. Just trapped, existing in the dark, waiting with no way out. And Rhea watched all of it. Every time, She had to watch her husband take each child from her arms, and she had to watch him swallow them, and she had to stand there with her empty arms and her full grief, while he went back to doing whatever it was kings did. Each time, something in her went quieter. Each time, something behind her eyes hardened. She was not screaming. She was thinking. By the time her 6th pregnancy arrived, Rhea had made a decision of her own. She was done. She went to her mother, to Gaia, the ancient Earth who had already helped one king fall, who understood better than anyone what it meant to have children imprisoned and suffering. She laid out what was happening. Gaia listened, and when Rhea was finished, Gaia said, "Go to the island of Crete. Give birth there, in secret, in a cave deep in the mountains where even Cronus cannot find you. And when he comes for the child, give him something else." Rhea traveled to Crete as the birth approached. She descended into a sacred cave on Mount Aegeon, deep in the rock, hidden from sky and sea, the 2 great domains that Cronus' senses swept across looking for threats. In the darkness of that cave, she gave birth to her 6th child. A boy, alive and healthy, radiating a kind of energy that felt, even in infancy, like compressed lightning. She wrapped a stone the size of a newborn in swaddling clothes. She carried it back to Cronus with her face composed and her expression showing nothing. Cronus reached out and took the bundle without looking at it. He never looked anymore, the ritual having long since replaced the act and swallowed it whole. A rock. He had just swallowed a rock. He didn't notice. And the real child was back in the cave on Crete, already being tended by the divine nymphs of the island, while young warriors called the Coretes stood outside and clashed their spears and shields together in a constant, clanging rhythm, making enough noise to cover the cries of a divine infant if Cronus' awareness swept anywhere near the island. The child was nursed by a divine goat named Amalthea, whose milk was said to be richer than anything the mortal world had ever produced. Can you imagine? The famous god of lightning, the god of Olympus, was breastfed by a goat. Anyway, he was kept safe, kept hidden, and he was given the name Zeus. Zeus grew up in that cave, knowing exactly who he was. His mother had made sure of that. He knew that his father sat on a throne that should have been different. He knew that 5 of his siblings were inside that father right now, alive and waiting. And he knew, with the patient, settled certainty of someone who has had their entire childhood to prepare for a single defining moment, that he would go back. He grew. He trained. He thought. He waited. And when the time finally came, when he was fully grown, fully divine, fully ready, he went back. His mother Rhea positioned him inside the Titan court as a cupbearer, a servant, someone who poured drinks and was otherwise invisible, because that is how power works. The powerful look at threats, and they look at their equals, and they never look at the servants. Zeus used that invisibility. He had obtained a powerful emetic, a substance so potent it could force an immortal to expel whatever they had consumed. He slipped it into his father's drink. Cronus drank. And then, slowly at first, then violently, he began to understand that something was catastrophically wrong. The stone came up first. Then, in reverse order of their swallowing, Poseidon, then Hades, then Hera, then Demeter, then Hestia. The gods came tumbling out of their prison one by one. Fully formed, immortal. burning with divine fury and the particular rage of people who have been waiting a very long time for a door to open. They looked at Zeus, this stranger who was their youngest brother, who had never been swallowed, who had grown up free while they had lived in darkness, and understood immediately what he had done and what it meant. He didn't make a speech. He didn't have to. What passed between them in that moment was older and deeper than language. They were free, and now it was time to finish what he had started. What came next was not a battle. It was a 10-year war so brutal and so violent that it did not just reshape power, it reshaped the physical world. Mountains were cracked at the roots. The sea churned without a storm to cause it. The sky itself groaned as though the weight of what was happening below had become more than it could hold. Later ages would call it the Titanomachy, the War of the Titans, and it was, without question, the most catastrophic conflict in the history of existence. On one side, Cronus and the Titans, ancient and enormous and furious, they commanded from their fortress on Mount Othrys, with Atlas leading them on the field. Atlas, the greatest Titan warrior, who moved through battle like a force of nature. Around him stood Hyperion, who commanded light itself, Iapetus, cunning and dangerous, Oceanus, who wrapped around the world like a boundary no one had ever crossed. These were not weaklings. They were not stumbling into a defeat they hadn't earned. They were the old gods, and they had held the cosmos for longer than memory. On the other side, 6 liberated gods, burning with the specific fury of people who had been imprisoned for the crime of existing, led by a youngest brother who had never been swallowed and who had been planning this moment his entire life. Zeus moved first, and he moved with strategy. He went down into Tartarus, down into the deepest pit in the world, where Uranus and then Cronus had imprisoned the Cyclopes and the Hecatoncheires since before the Titans ruled. He killed the guardian monster. He stood in that ancient darkness, and he offered the imprisoned ones something no one had ever offered them. Freedom and a choice. They chose freedom, and they chose him. In gratitude, the 3 Cyclopes, Brontes, Zeropes, and Arges, the greatest craftsmen in existence, went immediately to their divine forge and made 3 weapons that would define the age that followed. For Poseidon, a trident able to split the ocean floor with a single strike. For Hades, a helmet of pure darkness, which made its wearer invisible to every eye, mortal or divine. And for Zeus, the thunderbolt. The thunderbolt. Lightning compressed into a weapon. Celestial fire shaped into something that could be held, aimed, and thrown with the force of the sky itself collapsing onto a single point. A weapon that no armor could stop, and no distance could blunt. Zeus held it for the first time and felt the power of it move through him like a current, and he understood, with perfect clarity, that the war had just changed. The Hecatoncheires, those 100-handed giants who had spent millennia in darkness, chose their side with equal certainty. When the war reached its most desperate point, when the Titan lines held and the Olympians were being pushed back, and it seemed like ancient power might simply outlast young fury, the Hecatoncheires stood behind the Olympians and threw 300 boulders at once. The sound alone was enough to shake mountains. The Titan lines didn't buckle. They shattered. While the Titans reeled from that barrage, Hades put on his helmet of invisibility and walked, completely unseen, straight through the chaos and into the Titan camp. He found their weapons. He found their supply lines. He dismantled everything. He walked back out the same way he had walked in, unseen and untouched, having turned a desperate war into a certain victory. The Titans fell. Cronus and his brothers were taken and cast into Tartarus, that same ancient pit where he had imprisoned Gaia's children, now turned into a prison for him. Bronze walls, stone gates. The Hecaton shares installed as wardens, those 100-handed giants now assigned to guard the very gods who had once guarded them. A reversal so complete it felt like the cosmos exhaling. Atlas received a separate punishment, reserved for the general who had led the Titan army in the field. He was condemned to stand at the western edge of the world and hold up the sky on his shoulders. Not for a century, not for an age, forever. The war was over. The three brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, stood in the quiet aftermath and divided what they had won. They drew lots, because even brothers who had survived a 10-year war together could come to blows over the right distribution of everything. Poseidon drew the sea. Hades drew the underworld. Zeus drew the sky, and with the sky came the throne. Zeus had barely settled into his rule when the earth moved. Gaia, ancient, patient, watching from beneath everything, had not been satisfied by the outcome of the Titanomachy. She had helped Zeus against Cronus. Yes, but she had done it because Cronus had been wrong, not because she had wanted to hand the world to the Olympians. And now, watching this new generation of gods take their seats and begin to organize the world in their own image, she felt the familiar frustration of a mother who has watched one set of rulers replace another and seen nothing actually change. She reached deep into the oldest parts of herself and drew out something she had been keeping in reserve. The giants. Born originally from the blood of Uranus when Cronus had wounded him, enormous and ferocious, and now fully awakened, the giants rose from the earth and turned toward Olympus. They came armed with spears made from the trunks of oak trees and boulders torn from mountainsides. Their bodies so massive that the ground trembled under their footsteps. Their voices so loud that the sound of them moving was like a second storm under the sky. Zeus prepared for war, but then an oracle delivered a problem he had not anticipated. The giants could not be killed by the gods alone. The divine could wound them, could fight them, could hold them back. But the killing blow, the final act that would actually end them, had to be delivered by a mortal. By a being who was half human, carrying the blood of earth, alongside the blood of heaven. Zeus needed a demigod. Specifically, he needed one who didn't exist yet. He looked down at the mortal world and found a woman named Alcmene, a princess of Argos, descended from Perseus, one of Zeus's own previous sons. She was married to a man named Amphitryon, a hero in his own right, who had been called away from home on a military campaign. On the night before Amphitryon returned, Zeus came to Alcmene in her husband's form. He knew her husband's face, his voice, his manner. Every detail was exactly right. He told her the campaign had ended early. He told her he had missed her. Alcmene believed him completely. How could she not? When the real Amphitryon returned the next morning, he was confused by his wife's inexplicably warm welcome for a man she thought had only just arrived home. The truth eventually emerged. A seer named Tiresias confirmed it, and Amphitryon accepted what could not be changed. Zeus had already moved on, but Hera had noticed. She always noticed. And when she discovered that Alcmene was pregnant with yet another of her husband's illegitimate children, she made a move that was both cunning and devastating. She persuaded Zeus to swear an oath, by the river Styx, rather than the most unbreakable vow available to gods, that the next child born of the bloodline of Perseus would become king of Mycenae and high ruler of the heroic race. Zeus swore it, confident in the timing, certain that his son would arrive first. Hera moved immediately. She sent the goddess of childbirth to sit outside Alcmene's room with her fingers crossed and her legs crossed, a divine obstruction that prevented any birth from proceeding while she maintained it. Meanwhile, she reached across Greece to another pregnant woman in the same bloodline and accelerated that birth instead. A sickly child named Eurystheus was born first, prematurely, and inherited the oath's promise. Heracles would be born into a world where that kingship had already been given away before he drew his first breath. Alcmene finally gave birth, after days of agonizing labor, only broken when one of her servants tricked the goddess of childbirth with a false announcement that the baby had already arrived. To twin boys. One was Amphitrion's son, named Iphicles. The other was Zeus's son, named at first Alcides, and later renamed Heracles. The name meant glory of Hera, chosen in an attempt to placate the furious goddess. It did not work. Hera sent two enormous serpents into the twins' nursery while they slept. Iphicles screamed and cowered. Heracles woke up, reached out with both hands, grabbed a serpent in each tiny fist, and strangled them. He was a few months old. His nurse found him in the morning playing contentedly with two limp snakes as though they were toys. The child who had been born to help the gods had already started proving why they needed him. Heracles grew into something the world had never quite seen before. A man of impossible physical strength combined with an emotional life of extraordinary intensity. Capable of tremendous love and tremendous destruction in equal measure, often in the same story. He became the greatest hero of his age. He completed 12 impossible labors that Eurystheus assigned him as penance for a moment of Hera-induced madness in which he had killed his own wife and children. He walked into the underworld and walked back out. He wrestled death. He crossed every boundary the known world had drawn. And when the time came, when the giants rose and Olympus called, Heracles was there, fighting alongside the gods, delivering the killing blows that divine hands alone could not deliver. The great giant Porphyrion, king of the Gigantomachy, made his final mistake when he turned his rage toward Hera and lunged for her in the chaos of battle. Zeus, watching from above, then raised his thunderbolt. The strike that followed was the loudest sound the war had produced. Porphyrion fell. The giants, losing their king, began to break. Alcyoneus, who could not be killed on his native soil, regenerating endlessly, as long as he stood on the land that had birthed him, was dragged across the border by Heracles and cut down outside his homeland. Enceladus was buried under Sicily by Athena, pinned beneath a mountain, his struggles beneath the earth becoming the tremors and eruptions that shook that island for centuries. Mimas was destroyed by Hephaestus, who poured molten iron over him in a move the god of the forge clearly took satisfaction in. The Gigantomachy ended the way all of Zeus's wars ended, with Olympus standing, and everything that had tried to bring it down buried beneath the world. Gaia had one more plague, and this one was different from everything that had come before. After the giants fell, she did not reach for something old. She reached for something that had never existed. Something born specifically for this moment, forged in the deepest furnace of the cosmos. She went down into Tartarus itself, into the oldest abyss. And from the union of the earth and the abyss she brought forth the last and greatest of her creation. His name was Typhon. When Typhon rose from the earth for the first time, then the gods of Olympus looked upon him and, one by one, they fled. They actually fled. 100 serpent heads, each breathing fire, each roaring in a different language. The sound of every animal that had ever lived, all of them screaming at once from a single body. His lower half was 2 colossal serpent coils instead of legs. His arms, stretched to their full length, reached from the eastern horizon to the western. When he stood at his full height, his uppermost head scraped the stars, and the fire from 100 mouths lit the sky from the ground up, turning night into a terrible orange noon. Apollo turned himself into a raven and disappeared into the sky. Hermes became an ibis. Ares, the god of war, the god who charged into every battle screaming, became a fish and dove into the sea. Artemis became a cat. Even Hera, who had withstood Zeus's wrath and faced every challenge to her dignity without flinching, took animal form and ran. The gods poured off Olympus in a panicked exodus and scattered across the sky and the earth and the water, hiding in whatever shapes kept them invisible. But Zeus did not run. Zeus stood on Olympus and he looked at Typhon, at this thing that his grandmother had made specifically to destroy him, that had cleared Olympus in minutes just by appearing, and he felt it. He was afraid. The fear was real and physical, and he did not pretend otherwise. But he had been afraid before. He had been afraid when he was a child in a cave, hiding from a father who would have killed him. He had been afraid before every war. Fear had never been a reason to stop. He leapt from Olympus. He met Typhon in the sky above Thrace, and the collision was like 2 mountains hitting each other. Thunderbolts in rapid succession, each one striking serpentine heads, each one drawing divine ichor and burning scale and muscle. The air tasted like ozone and ash for miles around. For a while, it seemed like it might be over quickly. It was not. Typhon fought back with everything he had. He caught Zeus in his coils. And then, in a moment that should have ended everything, Typhon drew a curved blade and cut the sinews from Zeus's hands and feet, the divine tendons that allowed the king of the gods to move his limbs. He took them. He hid them inside a cave in Cilicia, hidden inside the skin of a bear, guarded by the she-dragon Typhon, and he left Zeus on the floor of the cave. The king of the gods lay in a cave. He could not move his hands. He could not move his feet. His thunderbolts were across the room, and he could not reach them. The throne of Olympus, the wars he had won, the world he had built, all of it meant nothing right now, in this cave with this specific problem. This was the lowest point. Not the wars, not the coup, not Hera's fury. This Zeus, helpless, on a cave floor. The world above him waiting. But Hermes and Pan had not fled with the others. They had followed at a distance, watching and waiting for an opening. While Delphine's attention wavered, they slipped into the cave and found the sinews hidden in the bear skin. They restored them, carefully, thread by divine thread, threading them back into Zeus's hands and feet. Zeus moved his fingers, felt the strength flood back, reached for his thunderbolt, stood up, and then the hunt began. Zeus chased Typhon south across the world. At every opportunity, Typhon grabbed mountains. The Haemonian range, entire peaks, and hurled them at the pursuing god. Zeus caught them on his thunderbolts and hurled them back. The landscape of Greece and the eastern Mediterranean was reshaped in those days by the things being thrown between them. The Fates, watching this from their stations at the edge of the cosmos, made their own move. Then they convinced Typhon to eat the fruits of mortality, telling him they would increase his strength for the final battle. They decreased it instead, and the gap between pursuer and pursued began to close. Typhon reached Sicily. Zeus was already above him. The final blow brought a mountain down on top of Typhon with a crack of thunder that silenced every other sound in the world for a moment. The ground shook across every continent simultaneously, and when the shaking stopped, Typhon was beneath that mountain. Still alive, gods could not so easily be killed, even by each other, but buried, pinned, sealed beneath the rock for eternity. The mountain was Etna, and for centuries afterward, when the volcano erupted, when fire poured from the summit and the ground around it shook, the people of Sicily said it was Typhon, still raging, still trying to get out from under the weight of Zeus's final answer. The last great challenge to Olympus was gone. Zeus had bled for this throne. He had been broken for it, been helpless for it, been genuinely afraid for it. He had won every time, and never easily, and always at a cost. But the throne was his, completely, permanently. Now he had to figure out what to do with it. Zeus set his seat on Mount Olympus and began the work of building the world that would come after the wars. And here is something important, because people often remember Zeus as a warrior, as a conqueror, as the one who threw thunderbolts at problems until they stopped being problems. And all of that is true, but it is not the whole picture. Zeus was also the god of justice, of sacred oaths, of the divine laws that held the cosmos together. He was the one the Greeks prayed to when they wanted fairness. When a king judged a dispute, he invoked Zeus. When two people swore an oath to each other, Zeus was the witness who made it binding. When a stranger knocked on your door, Zeus was the reason you were supposed to let them in. The law of hospitality, Xenia, was his law, and it was sacred, and breaking it carried consequences. He distributed the world among those who had fought alongside him. He established roles and domains and responsibility. He created, from the rubble of the Titan Age, something that had never existed before. A system. Loud and imperfect and constantly threatening to fall apart. But a system. And at the center of it, holding the whole thing together by sheer force of authority and will, was Zeus. The gods took their seats on Olympus, and the age that would define mythology. The age of Apollo and Athena, of Ares and Aphrodite, of Hermes and Artemis, of divine drama and mortal heroism and the strange, electric tension between heaven and earth began. Before Hera, before any of the great marriage dramas of Olympus, there was Metis. Metis was a Titaness, born of the first generation, the age of Cronus, and she was the goddess of wisdom and cunning. Not wisdom in the passive sense, not simply knowing things, but wisdom as a weapon, wisdom as strategy, wisdom as the ability to see around corners and think 3 moves ahead. She had been Zeus's ally during the campaign against Cronus, the potion that had made Cronus vomit up his children, that had been her idea, her preparation, her gift. Zeus owed her everything. And when the war was over, he loved her. or he loved her as much as Zeus was capable of loving anyone without immediately complicating it. They came together, and Metis became pregnant. Zeus was prepared to be a father, and then an oracle spoke. The prophecy said, "The first child Metis bears will be a daughter of extraordinary power. But if she bears a second child, that child will be a son. And that son will be greater than his father, greater than Zeus himself. And he will do to Zeus exactly what Zeus did to Cronus." Zeus heard this and felt the world tilt. He had broken the cycle, freed his siblings, overthrown his father, built something new. He had spent his entire early life being the answer to a terrible inheritance. And now the oracle was telling him that the cycle was not broken. It was waiting. It would come from the person he loved and trusted most. He made a choice. The same choice his father had made, the same choice his grandfather had made, but dressed differently. Not out of cruelty, out of architectural necessity, out of the desperate need to be the one who finally stopped the wheel from turning. He swallowed Metis. She lived inside him. The ancient Greeks believed the belly was the seat of thought and emotion, the place where ideas actually formed. And Metis, the goddess of wisdom, did not simply disappear when he swallowed her. She became part of his thinking. Her counsel, her strategies, her ability to see around corners, it all became his. Every wise decision Zeus ever made afterward had her fingerprints on it. She was not gone. She was just somewhere new. And the daughter she had been carrying, she kept growing inside Zeus. Week by week, month by month, the child grew inside the god who had swallowed her mother, arming herself, preparing herself, becoming more fully what she was always going to be. Then, one day, Zeus was struck by a headache unlike anything in his experience. The word headache doesn't capture it. It was the sensation of something inside his skull fighting to get out. Nothing helped. No amount of divine endurance made it better. He roared for Hephaestus, the craftsman god, the maker of impossible things, and ordered him to do something about it immediately. Hephaestus raised his axe and split Zeus's skull open at the crown. And from the cleft, fully grown, fully armored in brilliant bronze, her spear already in her hand and her gray eyes already steady, Athena stepped out, and the war cry she let loose when she emerged shook every corner of Olympus and rattled the stars. Zeus looked at this daughter, born from his own head, carrying her mother's wisdom and his power, and recognized immediately what she was. His favorite. The child who was most completely his. She would remain that forever. After Metis, Zeus made several other divine unions that were less about love and more about building the cosmic family that would hold the world together. He wed Themis, the goddess of divine law and the sacred order of things. She bore him the three fates: Clotho, who spins the thread of life; Lachesis, who measures it; and Atropos, who cuts it; and the three seasons, who gave the world its rhythms. The fates were not under Zeus's command. The fates predated even the gods in some ways, and Zeus, for all his power, could not simply override what they decreed. He could argue with them, could try to negotiate, but he could not simply abolish fate the way he could abolish a mortal life with a thunderbolt. This limitation would matter later. He was briefly with Eurynome, from whom the three Graces were born: Aglaia, Euphrosyne, and Thalia, the goddesses of beauty, mirth, and elegance, the ones who made divine celebrations worth attending. Then with his own sister, Demeter, an uncomfortable arrangement even by Olympian standard, he fathered Persephone, the daughter who would one day become queen of the underworld in circumstances that Zeus himself had quietly enabled, as we will see. Then came Mnemosyne, the goddess of memory. Zeus lay with her for 9 consecutive nights, and she gave birth 9 months later to 9 daughters, the Muses, the patrons of every human creative and intellectual endeavor. Epic poetry, history, love poetry, music, tragedy, hymns, dance, comedy, and astronomy. In a single act, Zeus had fathered the inspiration for every great thing humanity would ever make or think or discover. Then Leto. And here the story darkened considerably, because Hera was already very much present in Zeus's life at this point, and what was done to Leto showed, clearly and brutally, what it cost to be a woman Zeus had chosen to love. Leto was a Titaness, gentle and beautiful, and Zeus came to her and she became pregnant with twin divine children. When Hera found out, she issued a proclamation that traveled across the entire world like a command. No land, no island, no country, no shore was to give Leto shelter. No earth was to allow her to give birth. This was not a small punishment. This was the Queen of Heaven, leveraging her authority to make an entire pregnant woman homeless across all of creation. Every time Leto found a place to rest, word of Hera's decree arrived first, and she was turned away. She wandered, enormous with her divine pregnancy, unable to find a single square of earth that would hold her through what was coming. Zeus watched this, and did what Zeus often did in these situations. He helped just enough to solve the immediate crisis, without directly confronting the person causing it. He found Leto a place, the floating island of Delos, which had not been anchored to the earth long enough to technically fall under Hera's jurisdiction. A loophole, a diplomatic technicality, very like him. On Delos, Leto gave birth first to Artemis, born easily, quickly, as though the island itself was eager to produce her. She came into the world with her eyes already open and her independence already established. She was the goddess of the hunt, of the moon, of the wild places that existed outside civilization's reach. And from the moment she was born, she wanted nothing to do with men, with marriage, with any of the machinery that had made her mother's life so hard. She would swear an oath of eternal virginity and mean it completely. But before she could rest from her own birth, she turned around and helped her mother through the labor that followed. Because Artemis, barely minutes old, was already the goddess of childbirth too, and her brother needed her help arriving. 9 days and 9 nights Leto labored. Then Apollo was born. He arrived in a blaze of golden light that turned the floating island solid and anchored it to the ocean floor for the first time. He was the god of the sun, of music, of prophecy, of healing, of archery, of the arts. He was, by common acknowledgement, the most beautiful being on Olympus. A god who combined Zeus's authority with something Zeus had never quite possessed: elegance. He became one of the most beloved gods in the Greek world, the one who spoke through oracles, who taught humanity what the future held, who made the world make sense. And both of them, Apollo and Artemis, the twin archers, had Hera to thank for the particular shape of their birth story. An exile became a founding myth. A punishment became a legend. And then came Hera. Zeus had been aware of Hera for a long time. She was his sister, born of the same parents, swallowed in the same stomach, freed by the same act. She had grown up into a goddess of commanding presence and formidable intelligence. Goddess of marriage, of women, of the sacred bonds that held families and kingdoms together. She was the Queen Olympus needed, in almost every sense. And Zeus, who genuinely admired intelligence in ways that his behavior often contradicted, had noticed her. He pursued her. She refused him, not because she was indifferent, but because Hera was not the kind of person who was moved by power alone. The fact that he was king of the gods was, to her, more reason for caution than for surrender. She had watched what Zeus did to the women he wanted. She had no interest in becoming another story in that collection. So Zeus decided to be clever. He transformed himself into a small cuckoo, bedraggled, shivering, obviously cold, obviously struggling to survive a rainstorm on a mountainside. He found the spot where Hera liked to sit and he perched nearby, looking as pitiful as divinity could manage. Hera, who had an enormous capacity for contempt toward equals and almost none for watching something small and helpless suffer, picked up the bird. She tucked it under her cloak against her chest to warm it. Zeus revealed himself. The accounts differ on the exact details of what followed. In some, Hera yielded. In others, there was a complication that marriage resolved. In all of them, the outcome was the same. Hera became his wife. Their wedding was the first among the Olympian gods, and the earth flowered for the occasion in ways it had never flowered before, and every god attended, and for a moment everything was exactly as it was supposed to be. Their children together were 4. Hebe, the goddess of youth, who served as cupbearer at the divine table. Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, who had already caused enough trouble by being sent to obstruct Alcmene. Ares, the god of war, and Hephaestus, the craftsman god, whose birth was the beginning of its own complicated story. When Athena had been born from Zeus's head, this extraordinary, unprecedented act of solo divine creation, Hera had felt something complicated. Jealousy wasn't quite the right word. It was more like being told that the rules she had understood were not the rules being applied. If Zeus could produce a child of pure intellect and power from his own mind, then perhaps she could produce one through her own will as well. She gave birth to Hephaestus alone, without Zeus. Or so one version says. The other says he was born of both of them, but arrived already lame, his legs bent and feet malformed, and Hera, who had been raised among gods of radiant physical perfection and had married the king of them all, looked at her imperfect child and felt something she would spend the rest of eternity regretting. She threw him from Olympus. He fell through the air for an entire day and landed on the island of Lemnos with a crash that left craters. He survived. Gods did not die so easily, but the fall deepened whatever physical impairment he had been born with. He was lame from that point forward, limping through eternity, the only physically imperfect Olympian in a family of gods who plead. What followed, from the wedding onward, was the most famously complicated marriage in the history of mythology. Zeus was unfaithful. This is not a controversial claim. He was unfaithful constantly, prolifically, and with almost no pretense of concealment. He had affairs with goddesses, nymphs, titanesses, and mortal women. He transformed himself into animals, into showers of light, into the forms of other men. He used charm and disguise and In some stories, force. He left behind a trail of children, divine, semi-divine, mortal, legendary, that stretched across the entire Greek world. Hera could not punish Zeus directly. He was simply too powerful, and she had already learned what happened when she tried to confront him head-on. So she redirected. She turned her fury with the precision of a weapon onto the people who could not fight back. The women Zeus had been with, and the children he had sired. Take Io, a princess of Argos, a priestess in Hera's own temple, which made the insult dramatically worse. Zeus fell for her. Hera found out. Trying to hide the affair, Zeus transformed Io into a white heifer. Hera, not fooled for a second, asked Zeus to give her the heifer as a gift. He could not refuse without confirming the affair. He handed Io over. Hera assigned a guardian, Argus Panoptus, the 100-eyed giant, the most vigilant being in existence, whose eyes never all slept at once. He watched Io around the clock, never blinking all 100 eyes simultaneously, never letting the transformed princess out of his sight. Zeus watched this from above and sent Hermes to handle it. Hermes went in disguise, sat beside Argus, and began to tell stories. He played his lyre and spoke in the slow, hypnotic rhythms of someone with nowhere to be and nothing to prove. One by one, Argus's 100 eyes began to close. When the last one shut, Hermes struck. Hera, devastated, took Argus's 100 eyes and placed them in the tail of her sacred peacock, a memorial to a servant whose only failure was being outsmarted. Then she sent a gadfly after Io, an immortal insect specifically designed to sting without stopping. Io, still a heifer, ran from the sting across country after country, swimming across straits, crossing mountain ranges, her path so long and so winding that the sea she crossed near Greece was named after her, the Ionian Sea. She eventually collapsed on the banks of the Nile, and Zeus, at a safe distance from Hera's attention, quietly restored her human form. She bore him a son in Egypt and founded a dynasty there. Then there was Semele, the mortal princess of Thebes who had caught Zeus's eye. He had come to her in disguise, as an ordinary man, and they had been together long enough for her to fall genuinely in love. She was pregnant with his child when Hera found out. Hera's plan this time was elegant in its cruelty. She disguised herself as Semele's old nurse, a familiar, trusted face, and came to the princess quietly, as a friend. She sat with her and planted a single question, very gently. How do you know he's really Zeus? How do you know he isn't just a man who says he's a god? If he truly loves you, if he truly is who he claims, wouldn't he prove it? Semele had no reason to distrust her nurse. She had every reason to trust the love she believed in. And so the question took root, growing slowly over days, until it became something she could not set aside. She asked Zeus to prove himself. She asked him to come to her in his true divine form. Zeus heard the request and felt the blood leave his face, metaphorically, because gods don't bleed in that way, but the experience was equivalent. He knew what would happen. He had sworn by the river Styx to give her whatever she asked, and the Styx was the one oath no god could break without consequences that dwarfed even Olympus. He tried to dissuade her. He explained, as carefully as he could, that his true form was not something a mortal body could survive. She thought he was being modest. She insisted. He revealed himself. The full, uncontained presence of Zeus. The raw, celestial fire, the undiluted divine, the thing that existed before it learned to wear a face humans could look at, filled the room like the sun arriving inside a human house. Samael had perhaps one breath. Then she was ash and lightning-scorched floor and nothing else. But Zeus had been watching for the child. The instant he saw what was happening, he reached into the fire and pulled the unborn infant free. The child was not ready for the world. Months premature, divine, but still forming. And Zeus did the only thing he could think of. He cut his own thigh open and sewed the child inside and carried him to term himself. When the time came, the child was born a second time, from Zeus's own flesh, and the name the gods gave him reflected both births. Dionysus, twice born, son of a lightning strike and a king's thigh, born from destruction, born laughing. He would become the god of wine and ecstasy and theater and transformation, the wildest and most joyful and most dangerous of the Olympians, the god who reminded everyone that the line between celebration and chaos was thinner than they liked to think. Hera, who had burned his mother to ash, was not finished with him. She reached him through the grandmother who was supposed to protect him, driving Ino mad and causing the child to be passed from caretaker to caretaker until Zeus finally hid him as a baby girl with the mountain nymphs of Nysa. Dionysus grew up in disguise, in the wild, outside the world that kept trying to destroy him, which perhaps explains why he spent his adulthood turning the rules of that world upside down. And through all of it, the affairs, the punishments, the children, the wars within Olympus, and wars outside it, Hera stayed. She remained. She was the queen of heaven, and she had no intention of being anything else, regardless of what was done to her dignity. Two enormous forces in permanent orbit around each other, unable to achieve peace and unwilling to achieve separation. Then came the night Hera decided she had had enough. She recruited Poseidon and Athena, an alliance that must have required extraordinary persuasion, because Athena was Zeus's daughter and Poseidon was his brother, and both of them had strong reasons to maintain the existing order. But Hera made her case. She waited until Zeus was deeply asleep, and then, with the precision that only someone who has been planning something for a very long time can achieve, they bound him. Adamantine chains, the unbreakable metal, attached to every limb, secured so that no amount of divine strength could break them. Then they removed his thunderbolts, and they stood over the sleeping, chained king of the gods and looked at each other, and immediately began arguing about what to do next. There was no plan. Overthrowing the king was the plan, and apparently the plan ended there. While the conspirators debated, a sea nymph named Thetis, the same Thetis that Zeus had once desired and stepped back from, the same Thetis whose son would one day fight at Troy, went down into Tartarus. She summoned Briareus, one of the Hecaton shares, those 100-handed giants who had helped Zeus win the Titanomachy. He arrived at Olympus and stood over the chained king with such enormous, absolute, 100-handed presence that the conspirators lost their nerve entirely. They scattered. Zeus woke up. He looked at the chains. He looked at the empty space where the conspirators had been. He picked up his thunderbolts, and then he made each of the people who had tried this understand precisely and permanently what it meant to have tried it. Hera was hung from the sky by golden chains attached to her wrists, with anvils tied to her ankles, suspended between earth and heaven in full view of everything. She hung there, in pain, until she swore by every oath available to the gods that she would never defy him again. It was only after that oath, witnessed and recorded, and as binding as anything the cosmos had ever produced, that he let her down. Poseidon and Apollo, as co-conspirators, had their divine powers stripped temporarily and were sent to serve the mortal king Laomedon, building the walls of Troy with their own hands for a year as punishment. The same Troy that Zeus would later watch burn. The throne of Olympus was never seriously challenged again. Zeus had 4 children with Hera, and his relationship with each of them said something different about him. Ares was the god of war. He was enormous, physically magnificent, radiating the dangerous energy of someone who had never learned to be afraid and had therefore never learned to be cautious. He charged into battles with his chest open and his sword forward, loving every moment of it, switching sides when the momentum shifted, pursuing violence the way other gods pursued music or wisdom. Zeus hated him. He said so plainly, without diplomatic softening. Ares was the most hateful of all the gods to him, and the reason was simple, even if painful to admit. Ares was war without purpose. He was the brutality of conflict with none of the strategy. He was what power looked like when it had never been disciplined by consequence. During the Trojan War, when Ares was fighting on the Trojan side and was wounded badly by the mortal hero Diomedes, wounded, a god, by a mortal, which was humiliating enough on its own, he flew up to Olympus crying. He came to Zeus and complained about Athena, who had helped Diomedes land the blow. He came looking for sympathy. Zeus gave him a look that the myths don't need to describe in detail. He healed him because Ares was his son, and letting one's son die of a battle wound over a matter of principle was excessive even by Zeus's standards. But he told Ares, plainly, to stop whining, and then he turned away. That was the entire relationship. Apollo was different from Ares in almost every conceivable way. Where Ares was brutality, Apollo was elegance. Where Ares lived for war, Apollo was the god who made sense of the world. The sun, music, prophecy, healing, the arts. He was Zeus's other favorite after Athena, the sun whose existence seemed to justify everything Zeus had built. And for most of the divine age, that relationship was what it looked like. Zeus's most brilliant son, doing the work that made the world better. Then Apollo fathered a child on a mortal woman named Cronus, a princess of Thessaly, beautiful and sharp, and beloved of the god of the sun. She was pregnant with his child, and while she was pregnant, she fell in love with a mortal man named Isis and married him. A crow, white-feathered, the sacred bird Apollo used as messenger, reported the marriage to its god. Apollo's fury was instantaneous and absolute. He cursed the crow on the spot, burned its white feathers to permanent black, a mark that would be carried by every crow forever. And then he sent Artemis to handle Cronus. She burned. But as Cronus lay on the funeral pyre, Apollo stood over the flames and felt the grief arrive behind the fury, the grief of the child still inside her, the child that had done nothing and would now die before it ever breathed. He reached into the fire. He cut the child free from the burning body. He took the baby to the wise centaur Chiron, who lived on Mount Pelion and was the greatest teacher in the world, the mentor of heroes, the one who had raised Achilles and Jason and would now raise this boy. The child's name was Asclepius. It meant to cut open, named for the circumstances of his rescue from his dead mother's womb. Chiron raised him, teaching him medicine with the same seriousness with which he taught everything. Apollo added divine knowledge alongside the centaur's earthly wisdom. Asclepius absorbed both and became something new. A healer so skilled that he moved from treating illness to preventing death, to, eventually, quietly, step by careful step, reversing it. He learned to raise the dead, actually raise them. Bring back people who had already crossed the boundary that was supposed to be permanent. Hippolytus, killed and raised. Glaucus, saved. Others. The list grew. Hades noticed. The population of the underworld was not what it should be. People who were supposed to arrive were not arriving. He went to Zeus with his complaint. The dead were being returned to life, which meant the underworld was being cheated of its purpose, which meant the entire structure of existence, the cycle of life and death that gave the cosmos its meaning, was being undermined by a single healer who had simply gotten too good at his job. Zeus listened, and he agreed, not with pleasure, but with the cold clarity of a king who understood that some boundaries existed for reasons larger than any individual, however gifted. If mortals could cheat death, the distance between divine and human collapsed. If that distance collapsed, the whole ordering of the world lost its foundation. He threw a thunderbolt. Asclepius died. Apollo was standing somewhere nearby when it happened, or he felt it through his connection to his son. Or he heard it the way a god hears things. However the knowledge arrived. It arrived, and what followed it was a grief so total and so hot that it turned immediately into something else. He went to the volcanic forge beneath Etna, where the original three Cyclopes, Brontes, Sterops, and Arges, the craftsmen who had made Zeus's thunderbolts, worked their divine metal. The same Cyclopes who had given Zeus the weapon of his authority. The same ones who had made the thunderbolt that had just killed his son. Apollo took his bow and killed them. 2 of the 3 Cyclopes were dead before the third could run. The forgers of Zeus's signature weapon, destroyed by Zeus's son in an act of grief and calculated defiance. It was the most direct assault on Zeus's power that any of his own children had ever managed. Zeus was ready to send Apollo to Tartarus, the same pit that held the Titans. Let him rot there, in the darkness, with his grief and his defiance, for as long as it took to understand what defiance of the king of the gods actually cost. Then Leto spoke. Apollo's mother, the woman who had wandered the world without a place to give birth, who had suffered through 9 days of labor on a floating island because of Hera's hatred, who had never stopped loving the god, who had caused her so much pain, stood before Zeus and asked him quietly to spare her son. Not commanding, not demanding, asking. Zeus looked at her, and the answer he gave was not Tartarus. Apollo was stripped of his divinity and sent to live as a mortal for 1 year in the service of King Metis of Hera. No sun chariot, no oracle, no music that carried divine resonance. He was a shepherd, tending someone else's flocks on a hillside, living in the ordinary time of ordinary people for a year. He served his year. He came back. Zeus, eventually, restored Asclepius to life and placed him among the stars as the constellation Ophiuchus, the serpent holder, an acknowledgement that the healer had been extraordinary, even if extraordinary in a direction that couldn't be allowed to continue. It was, in its way, an apology. Not a stated one, but an action that said, I know what I took. Zeus did not create the first humans. That act belonged to older forces. But he shaped humanity across 5 distinct ages, making them, judging them, ending some of them, beginning others, and in doing so left his mark on every generation that has ever lived. The Golden Age was Cronus's time. Humans lived without labor, without aging, without suffering. The earth gave freely. People died peacefully, like falling asleep. It ended when Zeus's wars ended the Titan Age. Not by his design, but as a consequence of what he had done. The first paradise closed. Zeus created the Silver Age himself, a race who spent 100 years in childhood and a brief time as adults, and refused, consistently and uniformly, to honor the gods. Zeus gave them time to change. They didn't, so he ended them. The Bronze Age destroyed itself. Hard men, shaped like ash trees, interested only in war. Zeus watched them annihilate each other without needing to intervene. The Fourth Age was the Heroic Age, the age of Perseus and Heracles, of Achilles and Odysseus. Zeus populated this world with demigods and monsters and impossible quests because he had come to understand something about human beings. They needed opposition to become what they were capable of being. The heroes burned brightly and briefly, and most died young. The ones who earned it, Zeus sent to the Isles of the Blessed. The Fifth Age, the Iron Age, was the one that would never end. Ordinary people, ordinary suffering, ordinary moral complexity. The slow forgetting of how things had once been. Zeus made this age too. It was, in some ways, the most honest thing he ever made. A world as complicated and morally ambiguous as its creator. Zeus had a law above all others, Xenia, the sacred hospitality that said any stranger at your door might be a god in disguise, and the divine law required you to feed them, shelter them, and treat them with dignity. This was not a minor rule. It was the foundational social contract of the ancient world. And it was his. Lycaon, king of Arcadia, decided to test whether Zeus was actually watching. When a traveler arrived at his palace, a traveler who carried himself with a quality Lycaon suspected was not entirely ordinary. The king killed one of his own servants, cooked him, and served the meat to his guest to see if the divine palate would notice the difference. Zeus noticed immediately. He stood. With anger, he overturned the table. He reached for his thunderbolts, and then stopped, because killing Lycaon with a thunderbolt would be too fast, too clean. It would say nothing true about what Lycaon was. The punishment needed to fit what was already inside him. He looked at the king before him, and he let what was inside come out. Lycaon's clothes became fur. His face stretched into a muzzle. His hands became paws. His voice, trying to form words, trying to protest, trying to explain, came out as a howl. He ran from the palace on 4 legs and disappeared into the forests of Arcadia. The first werewolf, named for a king who thought divine law was something you could run an experiment on. Zeus returned to Olympus and looked down at the mortal world with new attention. Lycaon was not a singular aberration. He was a symptom. The more Zeus looked, the more he saw it everywhere. Human sacrifice normalized, violence as default, the moral framework he had built the world on simply dissolving. He called an assembly of the gods and laid out what he had seen. The gods were troubled. The earth provided their sacrifices, their worship, their meaning. But Zeus had made the decision before he called the meeting. He wasn't asking permission. He was announcing. He called on Poseidon. Together, Zeus opening the sky, Poseidon releasing the sea. They initiated the Great Flood. Rain without stopping. Rivers over every bank. The ocean pushing inland. The world filling from above and below. What had been civilization became a drowned silence beneath gray water. Almost everyone died. Almost. One man had been warned. Deucalion, son of Prometheus, that same Titan who had defied Zeus for humanity's sake, had built a chest with his wife Pyrrha and waited inside it while the world drowned around them. When the waters receded, they climbed out onto a mountain and stood in a world that contained no other people. The silence was absolute. They asked how to begin again. They were told to throw the bones of their mother. They understood. Gaia, the Earth Mother. Her bones were stone. They walked across the mountainside, throwing rocks over their shoulders without looking back. Where the stones landed, people rose. A new humanity. Harder, more resilient, built literally from the body of the world. Zeus watched from above. He had destroyed what he had made and rebuilt it. He had done it because it had been necessary. That knowledge sat in him the way certain decisions sit. Not as guilt, exactly, but as permanent weight. A creator carrying the cost of a choice that could not be uncreated. Before Lycaon, before the flood, before almost anything else in Zeus's relationship with humanity, there was Prometheus. And this story does not begin with a theft or a chain. It begins with a friendship. Prometheus was a Titan, but one of the very few who had seen which way the Titanomachy was going, and through his support to Zeus, he had fought beside him, advised him, been trusted by him in the early days of building Olympus. Between them was something that functioned genuinely, like the bond between two people who had been through the same war and come out the other side of it together. Then came a feast. One of the early sacrificial rituals, the first negotiations of what gods received and what mortals kept. Prometheus divided the sacrifice into two portions. Good meat, hidden beneath ugly organs. Bones wrapped in gleaming fat. He offered Zeus the choice. Zeus chose the pile that gleamed, and from that day forward, in all sacrifices, humans kept the meat and burned the bones. Prometheus had redirected the benefit of every future sacrifice toward humanity, using Zeus's own choice as the mechanism. Zeus understood immediately. He had been tricked by his ally, in public, in a way that permanently altered the relationship between gods and humans. He said nothing about the trick itself. The choice had been made and witnesses had seen it. Instead, he reached down and removed fire from the mortal world. No heat, no cooking, no light after dark, no forge. He took the tool that made everything else possible and simply withdrew it. He was waiting to see what Prometheus would do. Prometheus climbed to Olympus, or reached into the forge of Hephaestus, or touched the chariot of Helios. The accounts vary on the method, but agree on the act. And he took fire. Hidden inside a hollow fennel stalk, he carried it back down to humanity and gave it to them. Zeus looked down at the world and saw fire burning in human hands again. He felt two things simultaneously: fury at the defiance, and something underneath the fury that he would not have named, but that was very close to respect. Prometheus had defied him twice, had chosen humanity over divine authority twice, and both times had won. The respect made no difference to the punishment. Prometheus was taken to the Caucasus, the edge of the known world, and chained to the rock face with bonds nothing could break. Every morning an eagle came, divine and purposeful, and ate his liver while he was alive and conscious and unable to do anything but endure it. Every night the liver regrew perfectly, completely, so that in the morning the eagle could start again. Not for a year, not for a century, for thousands of years. Zeus, who had ordered this, who had chained his former ally to a mountain and sent an eagle to eat him every morning for millennia, still needed something from him. Prometheus knew the prophecy about Thetis, the one about whose son would be greater than his father, a prophecy that could unravel everything Zeus had built. And Prometheus, chained and suffering and immovable, refused to tell it. For thousands of years, he held the secret as the only leverage he had left. Zeus found himself in the particular position of needing information from the man he was torturing. He could not ease the punishment without appearing weak. He could not get the information without easing the punishment. They were locked, king and prisoner, former friends, separated by a decision that neither of them could take back. Then Heracles came. On one of his labors, he found the mountain. He killed the eagle with an arrow. He broke the chains. He freed Prometheus. Zeus allowed it, because Heracles was his son, and because the feud had run long enough, and because Prometheus was finally free. He shared the prophecy about Thetis and closed the last open wound between them. It ended not with victory and defeat, but with two beings who had heard each other looking at each other across an enormous distance and choosing, after millennia, to stop. Zeus had punished enormously. He had been defied by someone he trusted. He had maintained a punishment long past the point where it served anything except his own authority. And he had, eventually, let it go. Not all kings could say the same. When Zeus punished Prometheus for the first theft of fire, he also punished humanity for receiving it. But the method he chose was revealing. He asked the gods to build a woman, the first woman who had ever existed, made collaboratively, each god contributing a gift. Hephaestus shaped her from earth and water. Athena dressed her and taught her skills. Aphrodite gave her grace and desire. Hermes gave her a persuasive voice and a curious mind. Every god gave something. They named her Pandora, which means all gifted. Zeus gave her a sealed jar. He sent her to Prometheus's brother Epimetheus with a warning: do not open it. He had given her a curious mind specifically so she would open it. The warning was part of the design. She opened it. From the jar came everything that makes human life hard: disease, suffering, grief, envy, anger, old age, all the invisible weight that mortal existence carries. Poured into the world in a single moment. Pandora slammed the lid shut too late. But one thing had been pressed against the bottom of the jar when she sealed it. Hope. Zeus could have emptied the jar entirely. He chose not to. In the middle of a punishment designed to make human life harder, He preserved the one thing that would allow humans to keep going. That is not the act of a tyrant. That is the act of something more complicated. A being who punishes and provides in the same breath, who designs difficulty, and then leaves just enough light inside the darkness to allow survival. Whether that makes the design kind or not is a question the Greeks never fully resolved. Neither have we. Not everything in Zeus's story was catastrophic. Some of it was the kind of story that named the world. Europa was a Phoenician princess, beautiful, curious, living in a land of warm sun and cedar forest. She had not done anything to attract divine attention except to exist in a way that made existing seem remarkable. Zeus noticed her from above and descended, as a bull. Not a frightening bull. A white bull, impossibly gentle, with horns that curved like the crescent moon and breath that smelled of saffron and flowers. He appeared in the meadow where Europa played with her companions and grazed nearby as though he had simply always been there. She was charmed. She put flowers on his horns. She climbed onto his back, slowly at first, then fully. The bull began to walk toward the sea, and then it ran and kept running. By the time Europa understood what was happening, the shore was far behind her. She held on and looked back at the disappearing coastline and presumably reconsidered several decisions that had seemed perfectly reasonable in a meadow. Zeus carried her to Crete, the island of his own birth, the place where his mother had hidden him from Cronus in a cave in the mountains. He returned to the place of his own hidden beginning, the place that had protected him when he had been the hidden one. He revealed himself on the island, and from their union came 3 sons. Minos, who would become the greatest lawgiver king in the ancient world, and later a judge of the dead. Rhadamanthus, also a judge of the dead. And Sarpedon, who would grow into a warrior of extraordinary nobility and die at Troy while his father watched from above and could not save him. The continent to the west of Greece was named Europa. Every map drawn since carries, somewhere in its name, the echo of a Phoenician girl who put flowers on a bull's horns and found herself halfway across the world. A king of Argos named Acrisius received a prophecy that destroyed his peace of mind and eventually destroyed him. His daughter's son would kill him. He had one daughter, Dana, and he decided to engineer his way around fate using the most straightforward method available to a man with resources. He built a bronze chamber underground, sealed, no windows, no entry from outside. He placed Dana inside it with everything she needed to survive, and nothing she needed to escape or be reached. No sun, no wind, no men. He was going to outlast fate through brute construction. Fate, as has been established throughout this story, was not interested in being outlasted. Zeus looked through the bronze at the woman imprisoned inside it, and descended as a shower of golden light, pouring through every invisible gap in the sealed ceiling, filling the chamber with warmth in the only form that could penetrate what Acrisius had built, and penetrate Dana. Dana gave birth to Perseus. Acrisius, unable to kill them, but unable to keep the secret, sealed them in a wooden chest and dropped them into the sea. The chest floated. A fisherman named Dictys found it on the island of Seriphos and pulled them out. Perseus grew up and became perhaps the greatest hero before Heracles. Killer of Medusa, rescuer of Andromeda, founder of Mycenae. And eventually, at an athletic competition, a discus thrown badly in the wind landed where it shouldn't. Acrisius died in an accident that Zeus had neither designed nor prevented. just one that arrived, exactly as the prophecy had said it would. Regardless of every bronze chamber and sealed chest and desperate engineering that had tried to stop it. Fate didn't need cruelty. It only needed time. To understand what happened to Callisto, you first need to understand what she had chosen and why it mattered. Artemis had built a company of huntresses, mortal women who had given up conventional life to run with the goddess in the wilderness, to hunt and train and live completely outside the domestic world. Joining this company meant swearing the same oath. Artemis herself had sworn, no men, no marriage, no exception. The bond was real. The oath was sacred. The freedom it offered was genuine. Callisto had taken it fully and lived it faithfully, and was among the most beloved of Artemis's companions. Zeus saw her in the forest. He knew what she had sworn. He disguised himself as Artemis, the one face Callisto would trust completely, and approached her. She realized too late. She was pregnant. She tried to hide it for months, staying at the edges of the group, avoiding the communal baths, finding reasons to stay clothed. Eventually there was no hiding it. Artemis saw, and cast her out, even knowing what had happened. Because the oath was the oath, and the community's integrity depended on it holding. Then Hera found out, and turned Callisto into a bear. She lived in the forests with the full memory of who she had been intact, inside an animal body that could not speak, and could not explain, and could not reach anyone with the truth. She gave birth to a son in bear form, Arcas, raised by humans, who grew into a hunter without ever knowing what had happened to his mother. Years later, Arcas encountered a bear in the mountains. He raised his spear. He didn't know. He couldn't. Zeus watched from above, and this time he moved. Before the spear left Arcas's hand, Zeus took them both, mother and son, and placed them among the stars. Callisto became Ursa Major. Arcas became Ursa Minor, positioned close to her, forever nearby, forever out of reach. They cannot speak to each other. They cannot touch, but they can see each other across the dark. Every night, in perpetual quiet proximity. Hera, furious even in defeat, went to the gods of the sea and asked one final favor. Never let Callisto's constellation rest. Never let it dip below the horizon. And so Ursa Major circles the northern sky without ever setting, without ever sleeping, turning through the night in permanent motion. Zeus had caused Callisto suffering by deceiving her. He had saved what he could of her story at the end. Whether the stars made up for the bear is not a question the myth answers. It is not a question Zeus answered either. Among all his relationships with mortal children, Tantalus had been uniquely favored. A Lydian king, descended from Zeus's own bloodline, invited to dine at the divine table, the most elevated status available to a mortal. Zeus had extended to him the same trust he extended to almost no one who was not a god. Tantalus used that trust to conduct what he framed to himself as an experiment. He wanted to know whether the gods were truly omniscient. He designed the test himself. He killed his son Pelops, cooked him, and served the meal to the gods to see if they could tell the difference. Every god recognized it immediately and refused to eat. Every god except Demeter, who was deep in the fog of grief over Persephone's abduction and reached for a shoulder before she understood what she was holding. Zeus stopped her. He was not merely furious. He was something rarer, genuinely revolted. Not by Demeter, who had simply not been paying attention. By Tantalus, who had stood in the divine hall and served him his own grandchild to test whether Zeus would notice. He noticed. He reassembled Pelops, restoring every part, with Hephaestus crafting an ivory shoulder to replace what had been eaten. And Pelops walked away fully restored, gleaming, more remarkable than before. Tantalus was placed in Tartarus in a pool of clear water that came to his chin, beneath a fruit tree heavy with every beautiful thing. Every time he bent to drink, the water receded. Every time he reached for fruit, the branches lifted. For eternity. Everything he needed, within sight, forever just out of reach. The English language has carried his name forward. When something is visible but perpetually untouchable. When desire and denial occupy the same moment, we call it tantalizing. Named for a king who thought the gods' trust was something you could run an experiment on, and found out it wasn't. To understand the Trojan War, to understand how Zeus ended up watching his favorite city burn, you have to start years before the first Greek ship ever sailed. You have to start with a decision Zeus made to avoid a prophecy. He had been pursuing Thetis, the most beautiful of the sea nymphs. Then an oracle said, "Any son born to Thetis will be greater than his father." Zeus heard this and understood its implication immediately. He stepped back. He arranged for Thetis to be married to a mortal hero named Peleus instead, ensuring any child she had would be half mortal and unable to threaten the divine throne. The wedding was held on Olympus. Every god and goddess attended. One was not invited. Eris, the goddess of discord. She was left off deliberately because no one wanted her there. She came anyway. She walked in and threw a golden apple onto the table. On it, 3 words. To the fairest. Hera, Aphrodite, and Athena all reached for it at the same moment. The argument was immediate and absolute. No god on Olympus was willing to choose between the Queen of Heaven, the goddess of love, and the goddess of wisdom, because choosing meant 2 permanent divine enemies, and all 3 of them were the kind of enemies no one wanted. Zeus was asked to decide. He thought about it, and then he assigned the decision to someone else. He sent the 3 goddesses, escorted by Hermes, to find a mortal judge. A young man tending cattle on the slopes of Mount Ida, outside the walls of Troy. His name was Paris. And what made his selection carry the particular irony it carries is the story of how he came to be on that mountain. Before Paris was born, his mother, Hecuba, dreamed she gave birth to a flaming torch that consumed all of Troy. The seer Aesacus interpreted it. The child she carried would be the destruction of the city. Priam, king of Troy, faced the same impossible choice that rulers and fathers had faced throughout this story. Defy the prophecy by killing the child, or live with the knowledge of what the child would do. He gave the infant to his chief shepherd, Aegelus, and told him to take the baby to Mount Ida and leave him there. Aegelus left him, went home, came back 5 days later because he couldn't stop thinking about it. The baby was still alive, being nursed by a she-bear. Aegelus took him home and raised him as his own son. Paris grew up on the mountain, is strong, fair-minded, married to a mountain nymph named Onone who loved him completely, living a life of quiet integrity that gave no indication of what was coming. He had no idea who he was. until the day 3 goddesses arrived and a golden apple needed a judge. Hera offered him power, kingdoms, dominion over Asia. Athena offered him wisdom and the greatest warrior's mind in the world. Aphrodite offered him the most beautiful woman in the world as his wife. Paris chose Aphrodite. A man who had been given the chance to rule the world, or to be the wisest person alive, chose a woman. Hera and Athena, who had offered him everything else, became his permanent enemies, and through him, Troy's permanent enemies. The most beautiful woman in the world was Helen, already married to Menelaus, king of Sparta. Paris went to Sparta, was received as a guest, accepted the hospitality of a king, the sacred Xenia that Zeus himself had made divine law. And when Menelaus left for a funeral, Paris took Helen and a significant portion of the Spartan treasury and sailed for Troy. Greece went to war. Troy was one of Zeus's favorite cities. Priam, its ancient king, had honored him faithfully. The city's walls were strong, its people devoted, its culture refined. Many Trojans were his own descendants. By every measure Zeus used to assess human civilizations, Troy was good. And Zeus knew it was going to burn. He had known about it for a long time. The fates had written it. The thread had been measured. He could read what was in the design of things, and Troy was in it. Not because of what Troy had done, but because of a chain of events that he himself had set in motion, however indirectly, by stepping away from Thetis and arranging her marriage to Peleus, which led to a wedding, which led to an apple, which led to a judgment, which led to a prince who should have died in infancy standing on a beach watching Greek ships disappear over the horizon. He tried to stay out of it. He announced neutrality and ordered the gods to observe it. The gods nodded and immediately chose sides. Apollo, Ares. Aphrodite for Troy, Hera. Athena, Poseidon for the Greeks. The arguments on Olympus during those 10 years were constant, bitter, and occasionally loud enough to shake the mountain. Zeus intervened repeatedly from his supposed position of neutrality, sometimes helping the Greeks, sometimes helping Troy, trying always to maintain the balance that would allow the war to reach its fated conclusion without either side simply destroying the other before the story was ready to end. The moment that broke him, the one moment across 10 years of war where the king of the gods lost his composure entirely, was the death of Sarpedon. Sarpedon was his son, born of Europa, raised in Lycia, grown into a warrior of extraordinary nobility, who commanded his forces with a kind of honor that made everyone around him better. Not a demigod built for impossible tasks. Just a man who was also, quietly, divine. When the Greek hero Patroclus drove a spear through him on the battlefield, Zeus felt it the way only a father feels the death of a child. He considered saving him. He had the power. One motion, one intervention. The spear never landed. Hera came to him. She said, "If you do this, you open a door that cannot be closed. Every god who has a mortal child in this war will want the same exception. The dead will not stay dead. The order you built, the order you bled for, will unravel." Zeus sat with it. He understood that she was right. He understood that understanding she was right did not make the cost any smaller. He let his son die. He wept tears of blood over the battlefield, divine ichor falling from above, marking the earth where Sarpedon lay. He sent sleep and death to carry his son's body gently back to Lycia, to be buried with every honor his people could give him. It was the only thing he could still do. And then he kept watching. He watched Hector fall. He watched Achilles fall. He watched Odysseus's hollow horse roll silently through Troy's gates in the dark while the city slept. He watched the fires start, small at first, then everywhere. He watched Priam, the old king who had honored him faithfully for a lifetime, killed at his own altar. He watched the walls come down. He watched Troy burn. He had set the first thing in motion. He had stepped back from Thetis, arranged a wedding, assigned a judgment to a prince who should have died on a mountain, and called it fate. He had watched the consequences of that chain arrive, one after another, and had called each of them fate too, and had not been entirely wrong, and had not been entirely right. That is perhaps the most quietly devastating truth about Zeus. He was the most powerful being in existence. He could see, more clearly than almost anyone, where things were going. And he did not always stop them. Sometimes because he couldn't. Sometimes because stopping them would cost too much. And sometimes because he had been the first domino, and calling it fate was easier than calling it himself. The question, at the end of this story, is not whether Zeus was good. He wasn't entirely. He was also not simply bad. He was something harder to categorize and therefore more interesting. A being of enormous power who was also genuinely capable of grief, of mercy, of love, and of catastrophic misjudgment. Sometimes all in the same story, sometimes all in the same breath. He was born in a cave from a mother's desperation, grew up in hiding from a father who would have destroyed him, and spent his entire childhood preparing for a moment that lesser people would have given up on. He freed his sibling. He won 3 impossible wars. He faced the worst thing that had ever been made, was broken by it, and came back. He built a world from chaos that has been remembered for 3,000 years. He also swallowed the woman he trusted most because a prophecy frightened him. He watched women suffer for the crime of catching his attention, and turned away from the source of their suffering because confronting it was complicated. He punished enormously and sometimes wrongly. He sat on his throne and watched Troy burn, knowing, truly knowing, that the first domino had been his. The Greeks who built this story over centuries of telling and retelling understood something uncomfortable about power. That the people who hold it are never simply good or evil. They are complicated in proportion to how much they carry. And Zeus carried more than anyone. He was worshipped from Olympia, where athletes competed in his name every 4 years, to Dodona, where his sacred oak trees rustled in winds the priests said were his voice. Every king who sought justice prayed to him. Every oath sworn in the open air was witnessed by him. Every lightning strike was his signature. He was the answer to the oldest and most necessary question that any civilization eventually has to ask. Is there order in the universe? Is there anyone in charge? The Greeks said yes. And they built a god complicated enough to be worth believing in. This was the life of Zeus, father of gods, maker of worlds, the king who answered chaos with order, and was never, not once, not for a single breath of the divine age, simple.